In just a fortnight's time, world leaders will arrive in Glasgow for the COP26 climate talks. They are under pressure to produce a global plan to cut emissions fast. But climate action doesn't start and end with the world leaders in Glasgow. There are things we can all do to help cut emissions. Scientists say the most impactful thing you and I can do is to change what we eat. We spoke to carbon expert Mike Berners-Lee to find out how we can all eat green.
I'm Mike Berners-Lee. I'm a professor at Lancaster University and I run a business called Small World Consulting that helps organisations to understand their carbon footprints, cut their carbon footprints and respond in every way to the climate and environmental emergency that we face. The science has been clear for decades now that we absolutely need to deal with climate change, and yet carbon emissions are going up. So now we have a flat-out climate emergency on our hands. The question to ask is, how can I help to create the conditions under which that global systemic change become possible? And actually, when you start asking that wide question, we all have tons of agency. If you were to divide the world's carbon footprint up, you'd see that about a quarter of it is down to the food that we eat. And so we need a huge cultural change, and every one of us that makes a change actually makes it easier for everybody else to make the change. So the biggest thing that most people can do to cut down the carbon footprint of their diet is to reduce the amount of meat and dairy. And actually, that's very important from a climate perspective, but it's equally important if you care about biodiversity, or you care about feeding the world, or you care about managing disease risk. So from every angle, cutting meat and dairy is unquestionably the biggest thing that most of us need to do. So within the meat and dairy spectrum, at the very highest carbon end is beef and lamb, because they're the ruminant animals that burp up methane, and that more or less doubles the carbon footprint of that meat. And then you have other meats that don't ruminate, like pigs and chickens, but they do eat a ton of animal feed, which puts pressure on deforestation, and there's a carbon footprint associated with that. A little bit lower carbon, but still pretty carbon intensive, is all the dairy products, so milk and cheese, and then slightly less carbon intensive again, generally speaking, is eggs, but still quite carbon intensive. And then dramatically lower carbon are all the plant-based forms of having our protein. So after we've reduced the amount of meat and dairy in our diets, it doesn't have to be to zero, but a long way, the next most important thing for us to be thinking about is to make sure we eat all the food that we buy. You know, that's about when you go to the shops, only buying what you know you can eat, not buying things that you've already got something similar to in the fridge getting ready to rot. It's about making sure that the plates are finished. It's about making sure that leftovers are used. It's about making sure that spare food can be put into containers and maybe frozen. There's a whole range of simple strategies we can use to make sure that anything we buy from the shop actually goes into a human mouth. The worst foods to waste are the foods with the highest carbon footprint in their production in the first place. So make sure you're not wasting any of your meat and dairy. And then after that, there's like a hierarchy with your local apples, probably the ones you can chill out about the most. One way that we might start to cut our meat and dairy might be to go vegan one day a week. And that gives everyone an opportunity to just try out foods that maybe you're not used to, and it's a gateway to expanding that to having more days of the week in which there's less meat and dairy. One piece of really good news for anybody looking to cut the meat and dairy in their diet is that the quality and the taste of what's available has really changed over the last few years. So now, if you go into a good restaurant, you can expect to see a good range of high quality, either vegan or at least low meat and dairy option. And the other piece of good news, I think, is that my experience and the experience of many people I know is that as you start to eat more and more plant-based diet, most people find that they actually come to prefer that. They work out what they like, their habits change, what they like changes, and what you look forward to changes. So people should avoid air-freighted food because it's a carbon disaster. The good news is that if food can travel on a boat, that's about 100 times better than putting it on an aeroplane. So we can have apples, oranges and bananas at any time of year and feel great about it. But if something's too fragile to travel on a boat, like soft fruit or asparagus or mange tout or something like that, and it's come from a long way away, it will have been on an aeroplane, it's an absolute carbon disaster, and there isn't any place for that in the sustainable world. And if you feel that you need to eat that food, some good news is that it's actually much more sustainable to have the frozen version of it. And frozen fruit and veg is a pretty sustainable way of making sure we have access to a really varied diet throughout the years. So a simple tip would be to eat more nuts in every form you can get them in. Just a dramatically more carbon-friendly way of getting your protein in than any animal-based form. The reality is that there are huge complexities in the whole food system, and there are always individual products that have other issues other than carbon sometimes associated with them. And specifically on almonds, there is an issue around the water consumption. And often almonds are grown in parts of the world, such as California, where the water table's a real issue and they're very water hungry. But there are lots of different nuts we can choose between.